My name is Eleanor Price, and until that morning, I thought I still mattered in my daughter's life. I was sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. When Clara came in, she didn't even sit down. She just stood there with her arms folded across her chest and said, "Mom, you're no longer needed here." Her words sliced through me, sharper than any knife. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her, but the way her husband Mark nodded, the way he didn't even look at me but kept tapping on his phone, told me they had rehearsed this. They had already decided where I belonged, and it wasn't in the house I had built with my late husband. Behind Clara on the counter lay a glossy brochure for a retirement home. I recognized the logo before I could even bring myself to pick it up. My own daughter had brought it into my kitchen, laid it next to the sugar bowl, like an option for a new sofa or a different paint color. I stared at it, then at her, searching her face for some hint that this was a cruel joke, but she only raised her chin higher, as if daring me to argue. I wanted to speak, but my throat locked. My heart pounded so hard it seemed louder than her voice. 100 memories, Clara's first steps on this very floor, my husband's laughter echoing down the hallway. The Christmas mornings we had shared came flooding back, colliding with the cold fact that they were already planning my absence. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. Instead, I reached for that brochure with trembling hands, folded it in half, and slid it into my purse. If my daughter believed I was no longer important, then she had no idea what I was still capable of. After Clara's words echoed in my head, the rest of that morning felt like a blur. I sat in my chair, watching the two of them whisper to each other as though I wasn't in the room. Mark scrolled through his phone, showing Clara pictures of living room layouts. They were talking about new furniture, rugs, even lighting. It didn't take me long to realize they weren't redecorating for me. They were redesigning for someone else. I forced myself to get up and refill my cup, pretending I couldn't hear them, but my ears picked up every cruel little detail. "The realtor said the attic will need clearing before the open house," Mark muttered. Clara nodded, her tone brisk. "I'll call the cleaners tomorrow. Mom's old boxes are just collecting dust. Nobody wants that clutter." Those old boxes were my life. 40 years of photographs, my husband's journals, the letters he wrote me when we were young. To them, it was all junk. To me, it was my heart. I walked into the attic that evening, climbed the narrow wooden stairs, and stood among the stacks of worn cardboard. Dust rose around me as I touched the corner of an old trunk. Inside were my wedding dress, carefully folded and yellowed with age, and the quilt my grandmother stitched before she passed. I pressed my hand against the fabric and felt my throat tighten. How could my own daughter look at these things and see nothing but clutter? The next day, I found strangers walking through my living room. A woman with a clipboard was pointing at the fireplace, while another man snapped photos of the kitchen cabinets. Clara trailed behind them, explaining that the house was a wonderful space for a young family. Lots of light, great bones. My blood ran cold. She was selling my home while I was still living in it. "Clara," I whispered, barely holding my voice steady. "What is this?" She didn't even flinch. "It's just a showing, Mom. You'll be happier in Maplewood Gardens. They have game nights and yoga classes. You won't have to worry about maintenance anymore." I stared at her, stunned by the calm certainty in her tone. Maplewood Gardens wasn't a vacation resort. It was a retirement facility. I was 64, still driving, still teaching part-time at the library. I wasn't helpless. But in Clara's eyes, I had already crossed some invisible line into irrelevance. Mark stepped in, smiling too brightly. "This is what's best, Eleanor. You'll thank us later." That was when something inside me broke. They weren't asking. They were deciding. My role in my own life had been stripped away, quietly, efficiently, behind closed doors. That night, I sat at the kitchen table alone. The brochure for Maplewood Gardens lay in front of me, the paper edges curled where I had gripped it too tightly. I poured myself a glass of wine and stared out the window at the swing my husband had built in the backyard. The paint was chipped, the chains a little rusty, but it was ours. Every creak of that swing in the wind was a reminder of evenings spent with him, our laughter drifting into the warm Ohio air. Tears blurred my vision, but underneath the sorrow, a spark of defiance stirred. I thought of the savings account my husband had left, the one we had called our rainy day fund. It was modest, but it was mine. He had trusted me to know when the storm arrived. Sitting there in the half-dark kitchen, I realized it had arrived at last. The following morning, while Clara was at work and Mark was out running errands, I quietly packed a small suitcase, a few dresses, a sweater, my passport, and the photograph of my husband in his favorite plaid shirt. I slipped the folded brochure into the side pocket, not as a plan, but as a reminder of what I refused to accept. I called a cab, the driver giving me a puzzled look as I asked for the bus station. From there, I bought a ticket to Miami. The clerk glanced at me kindly, perhaps sensing the weight in my voice, and handed me the slip of paper. In my purse, I carried the small black notebook where I had written every household expense for years, every memory worth saving. On the bus ride south, I pressed my forehead against the window, watching the landscape blur by. I thought about how easily Clara had erased me from the story of our family. But as the miles passed, I felt something else stirring. An old resilience I thought had died with my husband. When I finally stepped onto the dock in Miami, the smell of salt water filled my lungs. The cruise ship loomed before me, white and massive against the blue sky. It was supposed to be a place of leisure, an escape for retirees and honeymooners. For me, it was something else entirely. It was a lifeline, a chance to breathe without someone telling me where I belonged. I handed over my ticket, my hands trembling, but not from fear. Not. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking into a space where I was unwanted. I was walking toward the unknown, carrying nothing but my grief, my memories, and the faint, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, I could still fight for myself. The ship felt like another world the moment I stepped on board. The carpeted hallways stretched endlessly, filled with strangers carrying cocktails and wearing wide-brimmed hats. I moved among them like a ghost, clutching my small suitcase as if it were the last piece of myself. I hadn't told Clara or Mark where I was going. For once, my life wasn't a detail for them to manage or approve. The first night, I stood alone on the deck as the ship pulled away from Miami. The shoreline shrank until it became nothing but lights scattered against the darkness. The ocean opened wide before me, vast and merciless. My husband used to say the sea was the one place that reminded him how small we truly are. That night, I understood what he meant. I felt small, but also strangely unshackled. At dinner, the next evening, I almost sat alone again until I heard a familiar laugh. It was Martha Reynolds, a woman I had known years ago through the church choir. She looked older, but her sharp eyes hadn't dulled a bit. She waved me over before I could turn away. "Eleanor Price, I thought that was you," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled faintly of lavender and salt. "What on earth are you doing out here by yourself?" Her warmth cracked the shell I had been building around myself. Over the next hour, between spoonfuls of chowder and glasses of wine, the story tumbled out. Clara, the house, the brochure on the kitchen table. Martha listened with her chin resting on her hand, her expression shifting between outrage and sorrow. "That's elder exploitation, plain and simple," she said firmly. You can't let them strip you of your home." The word exploitation stung. I wanted to protest, to defend my daughter somehow, but Martha's bluntness cut through the haze of guilt I had been carrying. She was right. This wasn't love twisted by care. It was control disguised as concern. The next day, Martha introduced me to one of her travel companions, a man named David Carter. He was in his late 50s, soft-spoken, with the cautious eyes of someone who had seen too many people taken advantage of. Over coffee. Martha explained my situation again, and David leaned forward, speaking in the calm, measured tone of a man who had spent years in courtrooms. "I worked as a paralegal for 30 years, he said. "I've seen cases like yours more times than I'd like to admit. If your daughter and son-in-law have been signing papers in your name or trying to move assets without your consent, you need to act fast." My hands tightened around the coffee cup. But what can I do? They'll just say I'm confused, that I don't understand. "Then you prove the opposite," David replied. "A video statement, notarized if possible, can demonstrate that you're of sound mind. Combine that with your original will or any financial documents you still control, and a judge will have to listen." The idea terrified me. Speaking into a camera about my own capacity, my own worth, it felt humiliating. Yet as I looked at Martha and David, I realized they weren't pitying me. They believed I still had fight left in me, even if I barely believed it myself. That afternoon, in the quiet of my cabin, David set up a small digital recorder. Martha stood by the door like a sentry, keeping the hallway noises at bay. I sat at the small desk, my hands trembling against the wood. When the red light blinked on, I forced myself to speak. "My name is Eleanor Price," I began, my voice thin but steady. "I am 64 years old. I live at 214 Oak Ridge Lane. I am fully aware of who I am, where I am, and the choices I make. My late husband, Daniel Price, left me our home and our savings. I have not granted anyone authority to sell my house or remove me from it. Any documents suggesting otherwise were not signed by me." By the time I finished, my eyes were wet. Not from weakness, but from a surge of anger I hadn't allowed myself to feel until then. It wasn't humiliation, it was reclamation. The truth of my life, spoken in my own voice, recorded for the world to hear. When David switched off the recorder, Martha squeezed my hand. "There she is," she whispered. "That's the Eleanor I remember." For the first time since Clara's words had gutted me in that kitchen, I felt the faintest spark of power return. The ocean roared outside the porthole, endless and indifferent, but inside that small cabin, I had begun to anchor myself again. I didn't know then how the video would be used or how far Clara and Mark had already gone. But I knew this much. I was no longer waiting to be erased. I was preparing to fight. When the cruise ended, I stepped off the ship carrying more than just a suitcase. I carried proof of my own voice, and with David's help, I had already mailed copies of my video statement and supporting documents to the county clerk's office. It was a fragile shield, but it was mine. I returned to Ohio on a gray afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds that mirrored the weight in my chest. As the cab turned onto Oak Ridge Lane, my breath caught. My house, my home, looked different. Fresh paint gleamed on the shutters. A new wreath hung on the front door, and the lawn was trimmed to perfection. It was a house prepared for strangers, not for me. The front door stood ajar, and laughter spilled out. I walked inside without knocking. The scent of new furniture polish replaced the familiar smell of old wood and cinnamon that had once defined my kitchen. My photographs were gone. The rocking chair my husband had carved for me sat nowhere in sight. In its place was a sleek leather sofa that felt cold even at a glance. Clara froze when she saw me in the doorway. Her wine glass tilted dangerously in her hand. Mark recovered faster, plastering on a smile for the guests who hovered behind them. "Mom," Clara said finally, her voice sharp with surprise. "What are you doing here?" I stepped further inside, my heels clicking against the polished floor that no longer felt like mine. "This is still my house," I answered. My voice was quiet but carried more steel than I knew I had. "What are you doing here?" The room fell silent. Guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the storm brewing. Mark set his glass down with deliberate calm. "Eleanor, we've been making improvements, preparing the property for sale. It's time to move forward. Maplewood Gardens will be so much better for you." Something inside me snapped. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folded court order I had received just days earlier. "There will be no sale," I said, unfolding the paper and laying it on the gleaming coffee table. "This house is under legal hold. Any attempt to transfer or stage it further will be considered fraudulent." Clara's face drained of color. She looked at the document, then back at me. "Mom, you don't understand. I understand perfectly." I cut in. My hands shook, but my voice did not. "You thought I was too weak to fight. You thought you could erase me while I was still alive, but I am not done. Not with this house. Not with my life." The guests murmured awkward goodbyes and began to file out, leaving the three of us in a room that suddenly felt unbearably tight. Mark's jaw clenched, his charm slipping away. Clara blinked rapidly, as if searching for some excuse that would make it all sound noble, even loving. "We were only trying to make things easier," she whispered. "You wouldn't have to worry about bills or upkeep. We just wanted to protect you." Her words might have swayed me once, but I saw the real fear behind her eyes. Not fear for me, but fear of losing control. "You protect someone by standing with them," I said softly, "not by selling the ground out from under their feet." For a long moment, none of us moved. The silence pressed heavier than any shout could. Then I picked up the order, slid it back into my purse, and walked toward the door. "This isn't finished," I told them. "We'll settle it in court." As I stepped out onto the porch, the wind caught at my coat. Behind me, my daughter's voice rose in protest, but I didn't turn back. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling, but for the first time in months, I felt taller than the roof above me. The fight was no longer hidden in whispered conversations or stolen documents. It was coming into the light, and I was ready to face it. The courthouse smelled of polish and paper, a mix that set my nerves on edge as I walked inside. My heels struck the marble louder than I intended, but I didn't slow down. In my purse, I carried everything that mattered now: my will, my statement, the order to halt any sale of my home. My life had been reduced to documents, yet those pages were my armor. Across the aisle, Clara sat stiffly beside Mark, their lawyer whispering in her ear. She wouldn't meet my gaze. I searched her face anyway, hoping to see a trace of the daughter who once held my hand crossing busy streets. But the woman at that table was a stranger determined to erase me. The judge entered, and the hearing began. Their attorney spoke first, his voice smooth and practiced. He painted me as confused, fragile, incapable of managing finances. Every word landed like a pinprick, as if he were trying to poke holes in my very existence. When my attorney rose, she asked for the lights to dim. A screen flickered to life, and there I was, sitting in that cabin on the ship, my voice quivering but firm. "My name is Eleanor Price. I am 64 years old. I know exactly who I am, and I have not authorized anyone to sell my home." The room went silent. Even Mark shifted in his chair, his smirk gone. When the recording ended, The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Price, do you confirm this is your statement?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I am of sound mind. What I am not is invisible." My attorney then placed the evidence on the bench, my original will, the real deed, and text messages between Clara and Mark discussing how quickly they could list the house. Each piece landed with weight heavier than any accusation. Clara finally looked at me, her eyes wet, her lips trembling, but no words came. The judge leaned back, then forward again. "The court finds Mrs. Price competent. The power of attorney and trust documents are void. Any attempt to sell the property is fraudulent. This case will be referred to the district attorney for elder exploitation." The gavel struck, echoing like thunder through the chamber. I exhaled, my chest loosening for the first time in months. Behind me, Martha touched my shoulder, her presence steady as stone. I didn't turn to see Clara or Mark. My eyes stayed on the judge's bench, the symbol of authority that had finally returned my dignity. As I walked out into the autumn air, sunlight broke through the clouds. I knew the fracture with Clara might never heal, but I also knew one truth more clearly than ever. I had fought for myself, and I had won. In the months that followed, my house slowly became mine again. The leather sofa was hauled away, and in its place, I returned the old rocking chair Daniel had carved. I found my photographs in boxes stacked carelessly in the garage, frames cracked, dust clinging to the glass. One by one, I cleaned them, hung them back on the walls where they belonged. Every nail I hammered felt like reclaiming a piece of my life. Clara didn't come by after the trial. Mark never called. But one morning, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting was his, uneven and rushed. He apologized, not in grand, flowery words, but in the kind of stumbling sentences of a man who had finally seen his own reflection. He wrote that greed had blinded him, that fear of financial struggle had made him cruel. At the bottom, he signed both his name and Clara's, though the pen strokes told me hers had been added with hesitation. I read it twice, then tucked it away in the drawer where I kept Daniel's old letters. Forgiveness. I decided wasn't a gift to be handed out like spare change. It was something earned, brick by brick, through actions, not apologies. Instead of dwelling on what I had lost, I turned toward what I could build. With Martha's encouragement and David's guidance, I established the Price Foundation for Elder Dignity, a small nonprofit dedicated to protecting seniors from exploitation. At first, it was just a handful of volunteers answering phones, but within a year, we were holding workshops, connecting people with lawyers, giving them the tools I had once thought were out of reach. And 1 year after I boarded that ship in silence and sorrow, I returned, not as a passenger running away, but as a speaker. I stood on the stage in the grand ballroom, looking out at faces lined with years, eyes searching for reassurance. "They told me I was no longer needed," I said, my voice steady over the hush of the crowd. "But the truth is, as long as we have a voice, we are never powerless." The room rose in applause, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it too. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.